History as it happens, August 4th, 2022. Our wall of separation.
The U.S. Supreme Court handed another victory today to religious rights advocates.
Today, a 6-3 majority of the court said that violates the First Amendment's guarantee of free exercise of religion.
It had to do with an unusual education funding program.
The court ruled Monday that a Washington State high school football coach had a right to pray on the field immediately after
an act that he lost his job over.
Today, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down a major decision in a case involving the city of Boston, the Christian flag, and freedom of speech.
Is the flagpole in front of City Hall government speech, or is it open to all comers?
And then somebody comes to it and says, we'd like to put up this swastika on your pole. Does the city really have to say yes at that point?
If it's a designated public forum, I think the answer is yes.
The Supreme Court is redrawing the boundary between church and state. Supporters of its recent rulings might say it's shifting that line back to where it belongs, on the side of free exercise. Well, the court's critics say its conservative majority is destroying the Establishment Clause to privilege a Christian majority. The subject may be old, but the controversy is fresh. It is the unresolvable conflict in our politics. And that's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
The challenge for those who want to protect religious liberty in the United States, Europe, and other similar places is to convince people who are not religious that religious liberty is worth special protection.
Samuel Alito's remarks in Rome at Notre Dame Law School's Religious Liberty Summit made headlines because of the way he mocked foreign leaders who had criticized his opinion in the Dobbs case, ending a constitutional right to an abortion.
One of these was former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, but he paid the price.
Well, that snark took up a very small portion of his speech, which lasted about 40 minutes. I found other parts of it more important, even if they were considered less newsworthy. Alito claimed religious liberty is under attack in the United States because of what he called the new moral code that is ascendant in some sectors. I took him to mean secularism or humanism. He didn't provide any specific examples.
And the problem that looms is not just indifference to religion. It's not just ignorance about religion. There's also growing hostility to religion.
Well, some of you may think he means there are too many non-religious people these days. Such as me, I suppose. I am an atheist, although freedom of worship, or to not worship in my case, is very important to me. Freedom of conscience. Or as Jefferson put it in his letter to the Danbury Baptists, religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship. That may be another way of saying religion is a private matter. But what happens when a public expression of faith or conscience conflicts with another person's expectation of equal treatment? Where Alito sees growing secularism as a threat to religious liberty, I'd say it's a sign religious freedom is thriving in America. But these differing definitions of religious freedom are at the center of today's battle over the meaning of the First Amendment and interpretation of American history. Whether the founders were Christians, whether the United States was founded as a Christian nation, and how your answers to those questions dictate which policies you might pursue today. No matter how small any modern controversy may seem, take the case in Boston where the Supreme Court ruled the city can't refuse to fly a Christian flag on a government flagpole, it reignites these fundamental issues, all revolving around the question of whether the Constitution erected a wall of separation between church and state, to borrow Jefferson's words once more. In a poll taken before the recent Supreme Court rulings, the Pew Research Center found that 19% of Americans said the federal government should stop enforcing that separation. About 30% of highly religious Christians said to do so. Right-wing Congresswoman Lauren Boebert articulated that attitude in some remarks to her supporters.
That is not how our founding fathers intended it. And I'm tired of this separation of church and state junk that's not in the Constitution. It was in a stinking letter, and it means nothing like what they say it does.
So if some conservative Christians today view the wall of separation as a hindrance to religious liberty, In the early republic, it made it possible for religious diversity to thrive. Americans tore down established churches. The most famous such affair took place in Virginia, where Jefferson and Madison effected the disestablishment of the Anglican Church. Our founders and the framers of the Constitution took great care to prevent religion from becoming a divisive force in society, as it had been for centuries. But they also struggled to draw a stark line between church and state, because they knew religion would play a significant role in civic life. Maybe another way of putting it is, whether we should have an established church is a no-brainer. Of course not. It's a relic of the 18th century. But whether a high school football coach should be able to pray on the field after the game in such a way that some kids feel pressured to participate, well, that's a trickier question. It raises the tension between the establishment and free exercise clauses. It may be impossible to know which way George Washington would go on that one. So why don't we ask Katherine Carté, who has kindly agreed to try to help us untangle this difficult issue. She's a historian at Southern Methodist University, a specialist in early American and Atlantic history. You may remember I spoke to her last summer when her book was published, Religion and the American Revolution and Imperial History. Katherine Carté, welcome back.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Well, as I often say, and I am not the only one who says this, the subject may be old, but the issues are fresh. And when it comes to the separation of church and state, it is always a fresh issue in American society. It's an unresolvable one. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Conflicts over the relationship between church and state are a basic part of who we are as Americans.
And that is because of the wording in the First Amendment, right? I mean, it comes down to that. There's more to it, but that's the start of it, isn't it?
The First Amendment itself is not terribly clear in terms of what it means by religion. The word religion is only in the First Amendment once, but then the amendment as a whole has two clauses, one that has to do with free exercise of religion and one that has to do with prohibiting a state establishment of religion. And those are two quite different concepts, and they rely on the same word, religion, which isn't actually that defined.
What are the most common misconceptions in your mind about church-state separation in public discourse as you listen to this cacophony coming from all quarters, right? The Supreme Court, politicians, commentators, podcasters?
You know, that's a great question. And I was kind of waiting for you to say misconceptions about the past or about the present. And I think that's actually the crux of the issue, which is that there is a history that's recoverable about the way the First Amendment was written, about what the framers of the Constitution believed, about what leaders during the founding era believed. And then there are also very specific issues in courts that draw on, issues related to the difference between federal citizenship and state citizenship and all of that. And often when we're talking about the separation of church and state in particular, we collapse those issues. So we sort of say the founders believed, or this is what the nation stands for, or the nation stands for, or was built on religious freedom. We kind of bring history into that discussion. But we're not always very precise about exactly how the history bears on the present or even what the present means.
Because so often the debate comes down to, at least in some quarters, who can pick or cherry pick the most convincing quote from founding father X, Y, or Z to make their point today.
And there's always a question about who exactly should we ask to speak to these issues? Is it the framers who were at the Constitutional Convention? Well, if that's the case, then, James Madison's voice is certainly very powerful. And Madison is probably the member of what we call the founding fathers who thought and wrote the most that specifically bears on the topic. Thomas Jefferson, of course, was not at the Constitutional Convention. So by that definition, he's not a founder, although, of course, obviously he is by other criteria. And so sort of which person you want to pull in and for which purpose. And of course, remembering that the people who we think of as founders or framers themselves disagreed a great deal on religion.
That's right. These ideas were controverted at the time. They still are controversial. I go back and forth on this myself. I say, yes, the founding and what the Constitution says or doesn't say is, of course, important. But at the same time, our hands weren't tied. What are your ideas on this, about this conflict between past and present?
I think religion is a really interesting way to think about that question. As you know, religion has the capacity either to unite or to divide. right? And that's actually in the First Amendment. So creating religious establishments is about using religion to unite a people, and allowing freedom of religion, allowing free exercise is about allowing diversity and recognizing that people have different views, right? So it's an issue that can either unite people or divide people. And the framers knew that. So in some ways, like slavery, religion was an issue that the framers kind of shied away from in the Constitutional Convention itself. So if we're talking about originalism, meaning the period of the 1780s and the constitutional thought that came into it and the document that was produced there, even if we include the ratification process and the writing of the First Amendment, we're going to get a very convoluted and sort of sideways understanding of the subject, because they're trying very hard. We know the framers cared very passionately about creating a durable, stable United States. And they were always aware that religion had the capacity to upset that, right? So they had to handle it very carefully. Now, if we expand our understanding of history a little bit, probably the period that has been most influential for creating kind of a body of literature about what the framers thought about religion or about the way that church and state ought to come together in the United States, it's actually the 1790s and early 1800s. And that's a really, really different period of time than the period when the Constitution was written. The French Revolution had happened. Thomas Paine had published his Age of Reason, which was hugely controversial in the United States. Of course, Paine was a hero of the American Revolution. And then for him to say that the Bible was not necessarily anything more than myth was very controversial. So in the 1790s and then into the first decade of the 19th century, you get people like John Adams, who had, of course, been a leader in the revolutionary process all the way back to his youth. You get people like John Adams in their older years talking about how important religion or a moral people will be, in future terms, will be or should be to the functioning of the United States. So do we include, when we talk about sort of the original intent of the Constitution, John Adams, when he's making those statements, he's often talking to a conservative New England minister by the name of Jedediah Morse. He was himself too young to be a founder. He's the father of Samuel F.B. Morse, the telegraph guy.
Oh, yeah, him.
I'm far less interested in him.
Yes.
But Jedediah Morse, he was one of the founders of the American Bible Society. And he was, as a New England minister, someone who passionately believed in a kind of heavy-handed Christian nation federalist division, right? So it's not the Jeffersonian view of politics that's very democratic. It's the older, what we kind of see as antiquarian kind of politics that comes before that. So, we get these statements in the early 19th century. And do we include them as definitive about what the framers meant? That's an open question.
Because the Second Great Awakening was taking place, right, in the early 19th century, a religious resurgence. After what had been a more secular, it would be wrong to say the Revolutionary era was an entirely secular age, but after a more secular age.
Absolutely. So in the beginning around 1800, you get some very dramatic revivals. They last for, 20 or 30 years. So it's hard to kind of put clear dates on the Second Great Awakening. But a lot of things are happening in that period. There's a lot of new religious groups being founded. And, it's hard to say there's one kind of central purpose or one central movement going on. But you can say that a lot of people were during that period very anxious about religious diversity, about the fact that the country they were in was not united by religion. So people at the upper levels of society saw that as leaders. They wanted to be able to ensure certain codes of law, for instance, to outlaw things like blasphemy, which in those days were still illegal, so that you could ensure that an oath taken in court was legitimate. How would you know that that was true? Or so that you could convert indigenous people so that they might potentially become the kinds of citizens that these cultural elites imagined citizens to be. So you get a lot of that anxiety, but then you also get a lot of people saying, I don't want to listen to what some crusty theologian at Yale or Harvard or Princeton is telling me to believe about religion. I want to be my own interpreter of the Bible. I want, the Bible should be apparent to everyone, and they want to look in there and agree. And of course, it isn't apparent, and they look in there and they don't agree. And so you get a lot of complications then.
In those days, there were established religions, and by getting rid of the establishments, it opened up a whole realm of religious freedom in the United States.
And when we talk about religious freedom, we have to remember that there were people who argued that religion was dangerous to the state. And there were people like John Jay, they talk about priestcraft. And then there were people who argued that the state was dangerous to religion. People like Isaac Backus, who's an important Baptist leader, who believed that the corrupting influences of the state and of worldliness on religion should be avoided. So there are people who are jealously protecting both sides of that conversation. When we talk about establishment, they did mean very specifically with that term state funding of a particular church. But here's one of the things that I think is most interesting as we understand the development of this concept. I think in the framing era, in the era of disestablishment, which goes on for several decades, it took a while to kind of sort out what were all of the functions of society that were attached to religious groups and what it would mean if religious groups weren't doing them. So education's a great example. Education had long been under the purview of religious authorities in one way or another. When they stop funding an established church in different states, the question is, how are they going to fund education? Should that be a state function? And of course, the development of public schools takes a long time. There's a pulling apart there that happens that I think the framers probably weren't necessarily thinking about in practical terms when the First Amendment was written. But as soon as it was written, that starts to be the kind of thing they have to deal with.
So in the decades after 1790, all the states abolished taxpayer support for religion and religious tests for office holders. And one of the most difficult battles was in Virginia, where Madison and Jefferson disestablished the Anglican Church, right?
It was difficult because, on the one hand, the Church of England that had been established during the colonial era had a lot of assets. And of course, those assets had been created by public taxation. And so there was the question of, if you just privatize the church, does that church get to keep those assets? Virginia actually goes quite far in this discussion in actually banning church property for a period of time, really limiting what churches could own. Other states didn't necessarily do that. Also, there were groups like Presbyterians in particular, who thought a mixed establishment might be better. So they didn't want to defund all religion. They just wanted to make sure that the benefits could go to more than one. But then that creates the problem that how do you define which groups benefits should go to? And that pretty quickly is the place where the discussion starts to fall apart and people move towards outright disestablishment.
So you mentioned the education issue. I think if the Establishment Clause is applied to a controversy today, we can take the case in Maine, right? Where the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Maine had to offer or provide tuition for religious schools if it was also going to provide funding for non-religious private schools. Critics of that say, well, you're breaking down the wall between church and state. You're allowing state money, public money, to go towards religious education or favoring Christian private schools. How do you untangle that?
It's a really interesting case. And I think a couple things we should keep in mind going into that discussion are that, first of all, this is a post-14th Amendment discussion. So it's only after World War II that the courts start ruling that the freedom of religion and disestablishment clauses in the Constitution apply to individual citizens. And so this brings federal attention to what, in many ways, in our system is a local matter, which is education, right? And education is always thorny and it differs hugely across the country, but now it's under federal jurisdiction for these questions. In the 70s, the court established something called the Lemon Test, which has been evolved a little bit over time. But what it dictated was that federal money could only flow to a religious organization if the government had a secular purpose and if its effects were primarily secular. So you couldn't discriminate against a church if a church is running a soup kitchen and a secular group is running a soup kitchen. If both of them are merely giving out food and the government has the aim of feeding the public, then you can't discriminate against the religious group. On the other hand, if the religious group is only giving food to people who will also sit through a Bible study, the secular end of the purpose is being changed. Those conversations have really shaped what we mean by establishment. We developed a habit when it came to education of assuming that religion could not be present in a school environment if it was in some way non-optional for students.
Or if they felt compelled to do it with this,
Absolutely.
The football coach in
Absolutely.
Washington State, right? And that was the critique
Absolutely.
of what he was doing there. To return to the founders, if I'm getting this right, they obviously were against the establishment of any religion, at least at the federal level, right? And then the battle played out state by state. And with the free exercise clause, they wanted to ensure freedom of conscience, right? But there's a gray area in there, and that's the part that's harder to define. In between the establishment and free exercise clauses, the proper role for religion in civic life. And I think that's what we're still grappling with today.
Absolutely. And most Americans will believe that people have a right to practice their religions, but we don't really have a definition of what religion is. And usually when we're talking about freedom of religion, we imagine a kind of gentle multiculturalism where you'll have a mosque next to a synagogue, next to a church, and they'll share resources. And what's important there is that those three groups are all kind of agreeing on what the rules are. That image also implies they're all kind of equally powerful. And in practice, they're not.
Yeah.
And so that's where a lot of the conflicts come in.
And in trying to strike the balance, for instance, here's a blog post at the National Humanities Center. It points out how Washington and Adams both proclaimed national days of Thanksgiving and fasting while they were presidents, and they were not against having salaried congressional chaplains. At the same time, the Treaty of Tripoli was signed during the Adams administration, which says, "As the government of the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, it has in itself no character of enmity against the laws, religion, or tranquility of the Muslims." So I guess that's a great example of what we're talking about, right?
Where exactly is the religion and what is the religion in each one of those circumstances? You know, in the case of the days of fasting and Thanksgiving, proclamations for those were generally written in pretty broad terms, and the people who wrote them, they assumed that anyone would be able to follow them because they assumed that anything that looked like religion would include things like public worship. But now we're often talking, when we're talking about free exercise, about things that don't look at all like public worship. They may look like proselytization. They may look like business practices, things like that. And so that can get really complicated.
You're talking about today.
Yes.
The battleground today. Well, some conservative Christians, according to a Washington Post article about all these controversies written by their religion reporter, they're arguing for the past several decades that the Constitution's concern about the establishment of religion or an established church was about keeping the government from interfering with religious matters, not about limiting religion in public life. So where does this idea that the U.S. was founded as a Christian nation come from?
The 1790s.
Well,
I mean, straight up, that's the answer, right?
That's often cited today as a reason to break down the wall of separation.
So as people were going through the crisis of the revolution, they were rebelling against a Protestant empire. They cast around for lots of different justifications for what they were doing. Many people felt animated by their faith that they were doing the right thing. Some of those people were Protestant, some of those people were Catholic, some of those people were Jewish, some of those people had other kinds of backgrounds. So we wouldn't say that everyone who fought the American Revolution had the same vision of Protestant nation that gets encapsulated in that Christian nation concept. But pretty quickly after the revolution is underway, public religion really craters. It really stops in many ways because it stops to be a uniting factor. And the Articles of Confederation really are silent on religion. The United States does not have a structure that parallels the British mixed establishment. After the Constitution is written, building the United States was an incredibly difficult and complicated process. And more than a few people, but by no means all people, not even all political leaders, believed that public professions of Christianity could fix that problem. And so in the 1790s and the early 19th century, you get sort of aggressive myth making. This is where we get Parson Weems writing George Washington's autobiography and the cherry tree thing, right? And you get a lot of myth making about a Christian nation. And that guy I mentioned, Jedediah Morse, he actually writes to John Adams and says, "I'm writing a providential history of the United States, and we need providential stories." And Adams kind of hems and haws and isn't quite sure how to give it to him, because
That's
that
right.
wasn't Adams's lived experience.
He was somewhat of a Unitarian by the end of his life.
He was absolutely a Unitarian,
Yeah.
yes. He was a Protestant Christian in the sense that he came out of that tradition, but today he would fall on the Unitarian spectrum.
Most colonists were Christians. So in a sense, we were a nation of Christians, not founded as a Christian nation. I think that's the problem with that phraseology. It's not true. The United States was not founded as a Christian nation. The Constitution does not recognize Christianity as the founding religion.
Absolutely not. And the British Constitution and Church and State, which is what they would have called it, recognized the British Empire as Protestant, right? So that's a shift.
Yeah.
But I would say—
And an important one.
I would say that we need to be careful when we say that the colonists were primarily Christian. And the reason for that is that, what I tell my students is that calling someone a Christian is almost always a political act. You have to be very clear by what you mean by a Christian. So the colonists, even if we're just talking about colonists and we're not talking about enslaved people or indigenous people, the majority of the people on the continent at the time are indigenous. So
I was referring to European settlers.
Right. So European settlers, even if we're only talking about them, a significant portion were what historians call unchurched, which means they came from places where there were established churches, but when they got to the colonies, they didn't affiliate and they didn't attach to anything.
That's right. Most were not members of a church.
Many, many people, if they were interested in theology, differed profoundly on what the purpose of religion was. They disagree on the divinity of Jesus. They disagree on every aspect of what it means to achieve salvation or not. And they disagree on whether Catholics are Christians. So we can't assume that they have any kind of shared faith. We can say that the vast majority of white European settlers came from environments where there were established state churches that were themselves either Protestant or Catholic. But that's a mushy statement, right?
Well, that's excellent because it's more reason to question that claim about being founded as a Christian nation. I find that to be baloney, and it's used as a cudgel today to support certain policies that I happen to not like. I am aware of my own biases, though, as I've made clear
We
here.
all have them.
Yeah. So about the founders themselves, and this is another tricky area when we talk about their ideas, their personal religious beliefs. Many of the most important founders were not Christian or nominally Christian, were not very devout. Talking about George Washington, John Adams, who you mentioned, Thomas Jefferson wasn't even a Christian. He did not accept Christ's divinity, and he despised priests. He did not like established churches. Quoting from Gordon Wood's book, Empire of Liberty, Jefferson said the Trinity was nothing but abracadabra and hocus pocus so incomprehensible to the human mind that no candid man can say he has any idea of it. You can probably tell why.
Those are powerful words.
Yeah, Jefferson is one of my favorite founders. But I don't know, is it even relevant what they thought about religion, their own personal religious ideas? Because some of them were, I should say, some were devout. Patrick Henry was devout. But does it even matter? Well, what's the point of going through these lists of founders and saying, this guy said we should be this way, that guy said otherwise?
When we do that exercise, we do it because we hope we can win the argument. We do it because we think if we can marshal the best quotes, we'll be able to say definitively that this is a nation that is supposed to be Protestant in origin or in nature, or it wasn't. I think the thing that's most interesting actually is, and here I'm drawing on a scholar named Tisa Wenger, is to look at where there's religious freedom talk. Right. And that's the phrase she uses. Throughout our history, there have been periods when religious freedom talk becomes really important. And every time that happens, as it is at the present, we're arguing about sort of fundamental ways that we're united or not united. It's incredibly not new for me to say the United States is divided right now, right? It's deeply divided in multiple ways. And this religious freedom talk that we're dealing with now, I think, is a way to kind of work through what our ties to one another are. But I will say that I don't think of the founders as particularly astute religious thinkers. I don't think that they spent a huge amount of time, for the most part. Some of them did, but for the vast majority did not spend a lot of time in theology or in this area. But they were committed to creating a lasting United States. And they knew that religion could divide us. And so I think they would have been resistant to any version of religion or any claim of religious freedom that fundamentally threatened the bonds of the United States.
And as I mentioned before in one of my poorly phrased questions, modern day, we'll call them conservative Christians, Christian faith groups, see church-state separation as a hindrance to religious freedom, whereas in those days, disestablishing the churches was the first step towards religious freedom. That's why churches flourished in the early 19th century.
There have been some real changes within conservative Christian groups about what exactly religious freedom means. Traditionally, for instance, Baptists were some of the prime movers in promoting religious freedom, and that is less true today. Some prominent Baptist groups have been less vigorous in that more recently. I will say conservative Christians themselves argue a lot about what it means to put nation ahead of other versions of Christianity. So there's certainly a lot of dissent within Christian communities over these questions. I think another important factor here is that during the Cold War period, the proselytization of Christianity became fundamentally linked to religious freedom. That's because of the limitations, and here I'm drawing on Lauren Turk's work. There was a connection made between limitations on proselytization in Soviet Russia and in communist China and what religious freedom had to mean in the United States. And so being able to spread your witness became more central to conservative Christian ideas of religious freedom than it was in the 19th century.
And when it comes to the tension between the Free Exercise Clause and the Establishment Clause, the Pew Research Center did a poll cited in the Washington Post, found 19% of Americans said the federal government should stop enforcing the separation of church and state. 30% of highly religious Christians say the federal government should stop doing that. Why don't we talk a little bit about where separation of church and state does come from? Thomas Jefferson and the letter to the Danbury Baptists. Who are the Danbury Baptists?
A group of New England Baptists who wrote to Jefferson, and he responded with this letter. So it's not an official document of state. It's not in response to a particular legislative agenda. It's a semi-private correspondence from a very prominent official.
Why is this important?
So the letter is important because Jefferson provides his strong endorsement of the First Amendment. He quotes the First Amendment, and it establishes that phrase, the separation of church and state, as part of the American lexicon. It then gets picked up by Supreme Court rulings in the post-World War II era. So then the phrase itself has become a part of Supreme Court jurisprudence, which kind of elevates it, even though it's not in the Constitution. And many Americans believe that it is, in fact, in the Constitution, when, of course, it's not. It's an interesting document because it's an interesting phrase, separation of church and state, partly because church and state are not the words that are used in the First Amendment, right? And so we kind of move from this religion to church, right? And that's kind of an interesting move. And it's also interesting because Jefferson talks about religion being something that's between an individual and God. Anything that is exclusively between an individual and God is sort of inherently intellectual or a matter of thought, as opposed to a public act. And so it suggests that religion is no more than our own intellectual freedoms, which, of course, that's a very easy thing to protect.
How about the Treaty of Tripoli?
Well, on the other end, that's about the state, right? Yes. That's about, does this state act in a particular way? And of course, it has a context. When the United States says that it is not acting as a Christian nation, it's differentiating itself from generations, hundreds of years of empires that fought explicitly on behalf of religion. It's a way of saying we are a new kind of state that will not be engaging in that kind of behavior. That kind of religion has nothing to do with the individual intellectual version of religion that Jefferson is talking about. That treaty, in a negative sense, is limiting acts of state. So very different.
It's a complex issue. It wouldn't be right to say, because of the Treaty of Tripoli, a football coach can't pray at the 50-yard line after a game. We have to make sure we keep things in their proper categories. So I guess we'll wrap up with your thoughts on the following. As I said at the top, this is an issue that will always be fresh, and it is, in a sense, unresolvable. The pendulum can swing back and forth. So maybe it's swinging more in the direction of free exercise, and it is weakening the Establishment Clause in the process, at least according to the critics of these recent Supreme Court rulings. But the pendulum can swing back, as it has throughout our history.
The really interesting thing for me is that many of these discussions are about majority-minority rights. A Jewish coach who demanded that their football players who were predominantly conservative Christians use Jewish prayer after a football game would meet extraordinary resistance from the school community. Pretty sure the coach would get fired. And most importantly, the Jewish coach probably wouldn't try that because as members of the minority, religious communities who are in the minority tend to restrain their own behavior a little bit differently than majority groups do. Yeah. So that's a majority-minority way of looking at it. But religious freedom comes down to us as an individual right. So we're talking about the majority enforcing its will through many, many separate individual assertions. That really asks the question, what is our relationship to one another, particularly when we're talking about the relationship of a citizen who's in a religious minority to a citizen that's in a religious minority? Is it okay for a teacher to demand something of a student in their own best interest? Those citizenship relationships are really challenged by this dynamic. And that's in that First Amendment because free exercise and establishment, one of those things is essentially an individual right, and one of those things is essentially a communal right.
I didn't get into the majority-minority issue enough in our conversation here, and I think that's the best critique, if you're on that side of the issue. The best critique of the Supreme Court rulings is that in the final analysis, they are showing preference to Christianity, and in a society that's becoming increasingly secular, right? And in a society that's becoming increasingly religiously diverse. The critics would say these decisions are showing preference to one religion, the religion of the majority.
Right, in whatever the majority is in a particular place. So conservative Christians in a place where secularism is very dominant genuinely feel, I think, that their views are disrespected. And so they feel in the minority there. On the other hand, someone who is non-Christian but is practicing in the United States is very, very aware of the dominance of Christianity within the American culture. And so those are just really complicated issues.
There's a lot of feeling in our society now about, feeling persecuted.
Yes.
The majority feels persecuted quite a bit. Well, I mean, I don't understand arguments made by some, not all, not by a long shot is it all, by some Christians that they're a persecuted religious group. I think that's crazy. I think our country is amazingly tolerant of religion.
You know, we're very tolerant as a society of what we expect to see under the category of religion. And we're very intolerant of things that really push our boundaries. If you get in a conversation with a group of people who are not religious practitioners about the way they respond to missionaries who knock at their door, for instance, you'll hear a lot of disrespect. At least certainly flies in the face of the way that most of us try to teach our children to behave to others, right? And I think that disrespect is powerful. You know, teaching conservative Christians, and I've taught at 2 Texas institutions, I was really struck one semester by students who articulated that reading narratives about coming out as gay in a conservative Christian community read to them like the way they felt when they had to tell a group of secular people that they were religious. Now, I think there was a lot more complicating factors there. I wouldn't push that kind of sophomoric analogy too far. But what I would say is that there are genuine obstacles if you find yourself on the outside of the norm. On the other hand, societies enforce norms. And even if we want to be an accepting and broad, welcoming culture, we do have boundaries. There is antisocial behavior. Now, I may put that boundary at physical violence, and someone else might put that boundary at, I need to be able to share with you my Christian witness. And that's not where I would put that line. But the argument is important. Where should that line be?
My feeling about this is all ideas must be open to ridicule. And even mockery. I know that can push past the line and become disrespectful, but any claim about human origins or religious claims about absolute truth, right?
Are you a fan of Anthony Ashley Cooper, Lord Shaftesbury?
No, I'm not. I'm more of a Sam Harris atheist, I guess you might say.
Okay, so Shaftesbury has a wonderful. He's one of the architects of South Carolina's Constitution in the 17th century. He has a whole treatise on ridicule, and he says exactly what you just said in 500 pages of beautiful prose that
Yes, better
any
than me.
idea, it's one of the foundational ideas of the Enlightenment. We have to be able to put our ideas out there, separate from them, mock them, and then take them or leave them or move on. And that's what brings progress. That is the core of that Enlightenment ideal. That's absolutely in that constitutional understanding of religion, right?
Sure.
You have to be able to be sort of separated from it. But you're right. In today's culture, we tend to see grievance as very important and feeling, and we may not have, a Shaftesbuorian view of ridicule.
I guess what I'm trying to say, if you're going to make an extraordinary claim about human origins or whatever, especially without having any evidence except what was written in a holy book many, many centuries ago, well, then those ideas are going to be open to ridicule. But I think the same should be said of scientific claims as well. Everything needs to be questioned. There are no holy cows. How about that? That's the best way of putting it.
Well, I think a whole lot of theologians would agree with you on that. And
Absolutely.
A whole lot of religious thinkers over the years have, not only had a vigorous sense of independent inquiry and rational thinking, and also great senses of humor. But I think the challenge then becomes that we have to also treat one another with respect enough to function together. And that's where that kind of uniting and dividing comes in.
That's all. You're right. We can disagree without being disagreeable. But to some folks, merely disagreeing or even just telling some people, although this hasn't happened to me in quite a long time, just telling someone I'm an atheist, they find that almost threatening, I'm not even talking about Christians. Matter of fact, most of the Christians I know are very open-minded people. I don't want to make it sound like they're all inflexibly rigid thinkers. There are other cultures where atheism is considered a much bigger sin. Let's just put it that way.
I think you're right about that. And, that gets back to that question of, was the United States founded by Christians? When we think about the entirety of the population, there's a difference between being an atheist and being agnostic. And, Pew tracks those separately. A lot of people who are uncomfortable with religion will back up and say, I'm not sure about all that stuff, but they don't want to come to a conclusion. And a lot of those people basically embrace some sense that someone ought to be in charge of this religion thing in the culture. They don't want to own it. They don't want to make the choices, but they might be sympathetic to arguments, for instance, against abortion made that are prominent in their communities. When someone says they're atheist, that tends to be seen on a different level. I'm outside of this system entirely. And so it prompts a different kind of debate.
I guess one way of putting it simply is that an agnostic says, I don't know if there's a God or not, while an atheist says there is no God.
And an awful lot of agnostics supported religious establishment in the colonial period because it seemed to make the schools steady and the society stable, and it didn't feel like it hurt them. And those same people may very well, after the passage of the First Amendment and as disestablishment happened, those same people probably often said, I don't really feel like going to church, and I don't really want to have anything to do with this, and please don't come talk to me about your religion, right? So they could be advocates for religious freedom now and for establishment in a colonial period. That's the big population that I'm most curious about.
Katherine Carté, you have reminded us there are no easy answers here. And even if there are, we can be sure this fight will continue as long as there is a United States Constitution. Go to historyasithappens.com where you can sign up for my newsletter. Just enter your email address in the box when prompted. My newsletter comes out every Friday morning. And that is also where you can find all the episodes of this podcast. New episodes every Tuesday and Thursday. History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.